joining once again. We are recording. I think I just saw the notice come up there. I think we had a great session last time. We're going to have, this is our second of 3 governance-ish presentations. For those who weren't on the call, or, I think we'd like to have these sessions are for you. So it is a matter for asking questions. There are not too many questions, and there are certainly no dumb questions. So please do chime up throughout. If you're more comfortable putting it in the chat, do so, or put up your hand. And if it gets too out of control, we'll start drawing straws or picking numbers or something to keep the questions to a minimum. So I'm going to see if we could do a presentation just to organize me a little bit. But maybe before we dive in, for those who did have the opportunity to either watch the recording or who were on the session last time, any questions? Did I leave anybody in suspense or in a state of mass confusion, panic, and any other forms of heightened emotion? Was it all governance issues solved? We're good to go. We have the basics covered. I'm sure that's the latter. Anything? Oh, Laurel.
I thought it was great, and I particularly enjoyed the parts that I could actually take back to my own organization and to be able to use within my board meetings. So I thought it was fabulous. Thank you.
Always glad to hear that. My reputation, or my ego always enjoys hearing kind comments. Anything else? Let's check the chat. Oh, we're good. Okay, so just let me just see if I can do a share screen without. Sorry, I'm on the road, so I don't have my usual multiple modern monitors set up. Also in a place that does have inadequate heating, which is why I'm dressed like it is cold inside, because it is cold inside. All right, just thumbs up if we can see a PowerPoint presentation. Perfect, thank you. Okay, we'll skip who we are. Everybody knows who we are. We're Sport Law. Just very, very quickly, because this will bleed into today's conversation, is, the distinction between governance and good governance is, everybody has governance, everybody has a structure, and the question is always, do you have the right structure? And we're going to go through some of the discussions about, what are those right elements? What are those pieces that you need to move forward to have a fair and safe sport environment? And I realized when I wrote this, I should have set up governing a safe and fair sport environment to avoid any painful associations with safe sport, but that topic will come up today. Again, as a recap, to look at the conversation with who your people are, your participants, and if you do have organizations as a member, to really clarify those entities, those individuals, and the relationship to either the national or the provincial or the club. All different levels, you're going to have some form of that relationship of member and participant, and how you start out and go from there. And again, knowing what our documents are and following through with them. One of the lines, and forgive me for repeating myself, that may come up a couple of times, is, governance really doesn't matter until it does. And a lot of this time, the process that we follow, the mechanisms that we have, keeping minutes, things like that, don't matter until they do. So, maybe it's a repeat question. Why are we here? So really, we're looking to set the stage, as it were, last week, or no, a couple of weeks ago now. And now we're really looking to sort of dig into some of the nuances and some of the pieces that we can address. And, in preparation, this one of the questions that came up was, does governance matter? I don't know. I asked someone on the call, does governance matter? Is it relevant? Or is it just a rubber stamp and gets in the way of the administrators doing their jobs? Administrators on the call, you do not have to answer that question. Anybody? Any thoughts? Well, my selfish answer is yes. Oh, Laurel, go ahead.
I think that it does matter because I think at a board level and in terms of dealing with our membership, it's really important for people to understand their roles and responsibilities of the organization. And I think for us, that is one of the biggest parts of governance.
Thank you. Peter?
Oh, I think it's hugely important. First of all, what's that saying? Like, who's minding the kitchen or something like that? There's a saying like that, if I'm not mistaken. And frankly, who has ultimate responsibility for the organization? It's the board of directors.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Sorry, and just make sure I get everybody's name. Kathy.
I think it matters when you have a problem and you need to manage it. So you need to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row to manage issues when they arise. So
Agreed, and it's sort of preventative measures, and you don't want to ever be reactive. You want to be proactive. I'm gonna get Kathy's at an old hand. It's an old hand. Agreed, and I think governance is important, and it is about all these things: transparency, clarity, and understanding. Having it so it's available, we can activate it in a moment of crisis or change. One of the maybe best compliments I got over working with an organization over a better part of a year and a half to navigate some conflict is our board meetings are boring again. And that was good because I think we want to have, we get into this later, generative friction and a lot in exchange of ideas, but they shouldn't be reality TV, right? And I think we want to make sure we really do have an understanding of what our board is supposed to be doing, and more importantly, perhaps, what it's not supposed to be doing. And that we're not having this scope creep into governance and operations and this blurring of the line. In sport, most of the time we do have, pieces that do have to be addressed by the board that maybe wouldn't be in Ford. But we still really need to have clarity about roles. So I think one of the pieces when we talk about what a board does, one of the important aspects is demystifying the board. I presume you can still see the presentation. Yep. Because I can tell you that sometimes board and governance can be vilified, right? That you are the evil empire. You are there, and every decision you make is unpopular and is out to get people, and you don't care about the sport. You're there because you like to travel, you like to spend evenings and weekends on Zoom calls, and it really doesn't reflect the reality of governance and the countless hours that are devoted by volunteers for the betterment of an organization and not so that they can control the galaxy. And I think that's a really, for me, I think demystifying it and humanizing the board, as it is often referred to, is a really important step in being a functional organization, whatever national, of whatever level, national, provincial, community, and territorial. because it's too much, just the board has done this, the board has decided that. And it dehumanizes and puts it at a distance and makes it easy to criticize and attack without recognizing truly what the organization is trying to do, what that board is trying to do. And use this graphic before and use it again is part of the conversation here is like, do we have the right tools for the job? Because so many times our bylaws, our terms of reference, our titles, all these things play into, we just don't have the right tools to address governance in the modern era. And there has been a significant shift. And we need to change and adapt to the times. The threats of declining levels of volunteerism. There was an article 2 days ago about PEI and the recruitment efforts that their volunteer organizations writ large across the province are having to go through to recruit people to serve on boards. And all these things play into, do we have the right tools? And I'm going to stop here just to make sure. I love interruptions. I have 3 kids under the age of 6. I'm interrupted all day. I do not lose my train of thought because of yelling, screaming, punching or kicking. Let's avoid the punching or kicking. But in terms of interrupting, questioning, that doesn't make sense, please do feel to jump in at any point. From there. And this, just maybe wrap up what I was saying earlier about does governance matter? I think good governance is invisible. And because no one is focused on governance if you are governing well. Poorly governed organization, you're going to hear a lot about the governance of the organization, and it's going to be in the spotlight, and that's not where governance should be. It should be, that question of like, oh my goodness, things are going so well. It's so functional, different, and all these compliments, and rarely does it get attributed to, well, we really do have clear operational lines, and the strategic direction from the board is really strong, and we've really implemented clear terms of reference and a communication structure, and we have a good budget and our strategic plans in place. Rarely does that event went really smoothly get chalked up to we have a strong governing body or we have a strong board, but it really does matter. So, my vote, if I got one, is governance does matter. It just doesn't get the attention it maybe deserves when things are going well. So, governing a fair and safe sport. A couple of things we wanted to touch on. Transparency and communication, as well as navigating conflict. And there'll be a couple examples, and these are quite broad topics. But really, from my perspective, when we think about the governance, these are the keys. These are the pieces that you need to do. And in our final session, we're going to go through a little bit of governance for the future and go and sort of loop back to maybe more of the static or structural elements of the piece of the code, resources to address genders on boards and different requirements. But for today, we're going to talk a bit more of the bigger picture and not sort of stick to those fundamentals, or those legislative requirements. So I was figuring out how to define transparency, because I think it's really important. I think it's one of the key pieces to, at least from a governing perspective, to build that trust, to build that confidence, to have the legitimacy in the eyes of your community to govern. Does anybody disagree that transparency is one of the key issues for a board? And 2, if you agree with me, what would you say represents transparency in the governance context? And I have your names and I will call on you if I have to. Kathy?
I think one initiative would be ensuring that you've got the appropriate information available on your website so that people can access it.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
that's useful. I think potentially communications are very, timely communiques or whatever you want to call it with your members, meetings with your members, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a question, and we'll go right to the hot button piece that's circulating in sport. Who here posts their board meeting, or who here posts their draft meeting minutes from their AGM before they are approved? Anybody? Kathy?
Yeah, yeah, we do. Wendy, don't we? I think we do.
We circulate them to the membership and before, and then they approve them at the next meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Who here posts their board meeting minutes?
We don't do that.
We don't, but we will be doing it. How's that?
Can we debate that?
I don't know. Yeah, well, I'm up for that.
So, it's certainly been a directive that has been discussed. Paul, Peter, anyone else, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's certainly been something that's discussed at the Sport Canada level, and we've seen discussions from different circles about this piece. I'm not enamored with it. I think that, one, proper board minutes are quite boring because they have very little context. They will say motion X, voted, it was passed, it did not, and that's it. I think there really is a question of, what we should be giving and how we should be communicating. And I think the minutes are something that we really want to be careful about what we are using them for. Wendy.
Yeah, I'm my thought or concern around it is, does it change the dialogue and the conversation at those meetings with the board members if they know that things are being written down and then it's going to be, put on the website or circulated out or whatever? I mean, I would, in our board meetings, I would say 90, 5% of the conversation's probably fine. It's just that there's stuff that's confidential or around employee engagement or some sort of, I don't know, there could be, something that's maybe a little bit more confidential of nature or not something that maybe wants to be aired out to everyone. Then how do you navigate that in the minutes? And is the person taking the minutes then tailoring the conversation and what's being, written down and sent out versus I don't know, what's being really said, kind of thing, for the board. So I think there could be instances where board members might not feel so free to speak.
Agreed. In 2 points on, and I do see the hands. One, I would say I would maybe review what you are taking down in the minutes because they're not meant to be like a court transcript, right? Witness one said this, witness two said this. I mean, you're never going to have two witnesses at the same time, so that was a bad example. But it's not meant to be a transcript, really. And the essential parts of those minutes are what were the motions, what were the results of those motions, and then it doesn't count. Will voted against, and he said this was the world's dumbest idea, and this cost us millions of dollars. And that's I think there you may want to consider what you're doing from a minute taking point of view. And then also, like, we do have the option to go in camera, and certainly for anything that I would say touches on sensitive information or information that would have personal details like salary, like employment issues, that's not for something to be recorded in the minutes. In terms of the discussions around, well, Will has a beard and we cannot have him at our organization, so we're firing him unless he shaves. You know, like those discussions, those HR pieces are not to be discussed. And if you need to go in camera, you can. Certainly, if you have to pass a motion, that's one thing to approve raises or things like that. But I would really I would really make sure that we are guarding carefully the type of conversations we're having in sort of open session versus in camera. At the same time, I will say don't go in camera for the entirety of your meeting unless you're calling it for a singular purpose. So I see a call. Wendy, does that help?
Yeah,
Or-
yeah, for sure. And I guess I was thinking more of, and you're right. I think going in camera sessions covers those confidential matters. So yeah, I hadn't really thought of that way. I mean, of course, but so yeah, that covers it.
Let's see. Yes, just to respond to Peter's comment in the chat, that is where I think a lot of the source of the discussion is coming from. My interpretation, I only read the code once or twice a day, is that it refers to meetings of the members, being your AGM or an SGM, if one is called, not that it would be the consistent board meeting minutes. My practice, at least with respect to, in my recommendation with respect to board meeting minutes, is that we are very deliberate in the information we share, and we actually put our communique that says, at the last board meeting, the board did this. Drank champagne, ate caviar, wasted your money. No. But like, what are the serious things that they've accomplished and the implications of it that gives a little more meat to the bone than simply a motion was passed to award nationals to X city in 2026. Put out something said, board is pleased to announce that the board has been awarded this, and pleased with the submissions, blah, 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 blah. That actually is information and is useful to your membership, rather than just the dry minutes. Paul.
Yeah, just maybe a comment and a question. My experience of seeing boards that post their minutes, they become very dry and not a lot of context. So I think there's that balancing act of what's enough information should you need to go back. Use your terminology before. Governance isn't important until it is important. So what was discussional that didn't necessarily need a motion, but you might need to go back and see what the discussion was at the board level. But correct me if I'm wrong, Will, your board minutes, even though not published, could be called for. And I think we've seen that by a standing committee from the government that, I don't know what terminology we use here, but called upon a number of national sport organisations to produce their minutes for a standing committee. So although we don't post them, we have to be cognizant that what we do write in them, they could be called for by government. And I'm going to presume maybe even in legally, if there was a case, could they be called for?
Yeah, potentially. And that's why my wife continually says, stop writing me like this is going to be read back to you in a court of law. But that is why anybody who does write something that could be called is always sort of very careful. Yeah, that's very true. I with great deference to the committee, was quite interesting with respect to some of their comments, because some of the minutes that they identified as good, what I would say were a little bit more transcript like, which I think is problematic, because we're not here to have the blow by blow. I think it was Wendy's comments earlier. We want to have a disagreement around the table, but as we talked about in our last session, once that board votes, that's the voice of the board. That's the board's position with respect to whatever that issue is. It's not the debate that happened. And sometimes we always have to be conscious that, we don't want to have, and I'd be curious to know if anybody has this experience, that never-ending issue that, like, no, we resolved that. We had a vote to resolve that last time based on the vote that we had 3 months ago, based on the issue that we had 6 months ago. So I think we do want to make sure that, you have debate, you have robust debate, you have the vote, the issue's closed, and you move on. So, yeah, minute taking is an art form. I will, having done it for different organizations, helped organizations review them. It is an art form, but I would say if you can have a standard practice on what information you include, I would. Jane.
Just thanks. Just a question with regard to in-camera portions of meetings. I've heard a couple of, or seen a couple of different interpretations. One that you have to come out of or rise from in-camera to make a motion. And if that's correct, then, and I know you need to keep a record of what's said in camera, although that typically is available to fewer people than your regular minutes would be. But if you need to rise from in camera to make a motion, then if that's correct, I saw you nod your head, then I'm assuming that you need to be kind of careful about what that motion is as well.
Yes. And I think, I don't want to say it's the proverbial tree falling in the woods, but if you pass a motion in camera and the definition of the in camera is no one's to talk about it, well, how can we then verify what it begins this bit of a circular piece.
Yeah.
So yes, we do need to make sure that there is a documentation, and typically the in camera are often because we are discussing sensitive matters that we don't want to have, if we have guests, because really that's, a lot of that in camera piece was because you would have guests and you say, we're actually going to move this and have a deliberation without the guest present. So yeah, you do need to make sure it is included for the minutes that you rise out of that in camera session.
And that you can't make a motion in camera, or can you make a motion in camera too?
My practice is that you can make a motion to go out of camera. And but you can often what I will see in a reality, and this is always what the fun thing is that governance is very black and white, but that's not how all organizations function, is that the matter is decided in camera. Then you go out and you do rubber stamp it in the regular meeting. And this is board meetings that we're referring to right now. Where are we at with hands? Lori.
Hey, Will. Hi, everybody. So Will, you mentioned about proper note taking, and I think the challenges for a lot of us in not-for-profit sport in particular is, often we don't have those folks within the board structure that actually have that, the qualities. And so guidance, because it's one thing that has never really come to light is what is required for effective note taking. And I know Wendy had mentioned, what are you supposed to capture? We do very top line stuff. Understanding the importance, as you said, of the motions and any of the key discussions as opposed to the minutia of the meeting. But there doesn't feel to be, I've been involved in boards for a while now, that really good specific direction for things like what the secretary should be capturing. And so I don't know if there's anything existing that can be shared at some point, because I know in a lot of cases it's like, hey, you want to be the secretary? Great, thanks. Just, this is what we got to do. And so there never seems to be a lot of guidance for that role. And I think it's a really critical role as we're discovering. So just wanted to kind of ask if there was something that we could share. I'm thinking more along the lines up for our secretary, who's brand new to the role, and we struggled to fill the role, so that we can really provide her what's required to do this job and this role effectively.
Definitely, and I'll send through some resources that I use just
Thank you.
steal them from online. Apologies for the not plagiarism because they're on the site, but like I think from my perspective, date who's in attendance, that you have quorum. What are the motions, and what was passed, and what was like. That's the core that you need. You can put a bit more detail on it, but like those are the cores pieces, and then of course you have your reports pieces like that. I think there's a Robert's Rules summary book. I know Robert's Rules causes people to sort of eyes roll back in their head. There are some very helpful pieces in that. That summary, which is like this big compared to the book, which is like this big, covers off 98% of the issues that you would run in a meeting. And I would say for the minutes, like a lot of this, I feel like I'm increasingly just as things get busy, and you sort of say, what's a process? What's the process? And I think from your minutes, it is something you can have a standard template that you go through, and this is the structure. At the beginning of the year, you put your board members' names on it, and you scratch them off or you highlight them. You figure your system to sort of note that they are in attendance. You confirm what you have and you go through and you say, what was our process? Do we have a land acknowledgement? Do we have a conflict of interest? Do you review our mission, vision, values? At the start, you go through that sequential checklist so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single meeting. You just have that template and you go forward with it. So at least you can be capturing those core things, and then everybody figures out what they're comfortable with in terms of capturing the dialogue, and go from there. But I would highly recommend that very short Robert's Rules. It can be a really helpful thing for clarifying the rules and responsibilities of the secretary. There's no such thing as a friendly amendment, and you can pass things by unanimous consent without a vote. Two helpful things. Laurel.
Could you clarify for me, with an in-camera meeting, what kind of minutes need to be taken, and from there, where do they go?
You wouldn't record in camera. That would be a discussion that would be intentionally off the record. And then that's why you would arise from the in-camera session to document with whatever decision was made during the in-camera piece. Or not, I shouldn't say decision, what you would document the matter of discussion in the in-camera piece.
Thank you.
So most of the time you would be looking to address employment, salary, decisions about continuing or non-continuation of someone's role with an organization are often what we see. Those are the usual things you'd have discussed in camera. To the extent like complaints or things like that would come through, you'd be addressing them there. But employment is really the big one that comes through. Thank you for the questions. Those were great. Peter, did we address your question in the chat? I don't think we did.
No, I think it's good. Some people responded. Yeah. Oh, good. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah. They'll often ask for them. I think that's them just doing the due diligence. So I will say I was trying to figure out what fancy definition of transparency, and then I consulted the Oracle that is Google, and I actually like this one. And I didn't have to do any other digging. I did pull up some of the old texts, and they were too wordy and too cumbersome. But it's really this. I think it is. This notion of allowing light to pass through, like that. That's really what we're trying to do. Is we're just trying to shed light on the operations of the organization, and that they can be seen and seen clearly. So whatever we are doing, whatever our communications, that's always what we're trying to do. And people have a really good radar most of the time to know when they're being told something that's a partial or a half truth, and they know that. So I think it is looking to say, how can we shed light on our operations, our governance, so that people can understand what's going on, so that there's no question marks. They don't think things are being hid. And for anybody who's been in a session with me before, I'm quite enamored with this quote. And I think culture is a word that's used a lot in sport. I think it's probably fair to argue that it's used too much sometimes. But I do think, I like this notion of culture is a commitment. It's an ongoing commitment. And there's no singular data point, there's no singular aspect, there's no single piece of the puzzle that says, now we have a good culture or a bad culture. It's this living relationship that there's all these different elements that go into shaping culture: history, background, funding, values, commitments, capacity, codes of conduct. All these elements all flow into to culture. And I think when we're thinking about transparency and good governance and how to be fair and how to make a safe sport, this is really where we look at what are all the different elements that we can do, big and small, to shape the culture, to shape the environment, and how do we ensure that it's a commitment and not just a slogan. Anybody have a different definition of culture? I always like to ask that question because I think it's a word that's used a lot, but we don't always nail it down to exactly what it is. And if anybody is interested, the Culture Code is quite a good airplane read. If you'd like to read about someone who visited a bunch of high performing cultures. So, communication challenges. I think we need to be we need to ensure communicating with our members, with our participants, with our community, but we also need to be careful at how we're doing it. And we're not overwhelming everybody. There is a volume of email. In my personal, I read my work emails, but in my personal emails that I just go delete and delete reams and reams and reams of emails because of something I signed up for, or a club I was part of. And, there's no meaningful engagement. So how do we make sure we're communicating? How do we make sure we're bringing value to our communications without overwhelming everybody? And I think, we cannot treat everybody in our ecosystem, if we can call it that, the same. So when we're looking at our communications and we're crafting our messages to folks, how we deal with our members, how we deal with our participants, how we deal with the communities are going to be very different. Another group is how we deal with our executive directors at the provincial or territorial level. Like, what are the key information that we need to be providing? Is it a monthly newsletter, a quarterly newsletter? Or is it more frequently if we have nationals coming up or qualifications or different aspects we need to address? And how are we crafting the messages to be focused and to be useful? Have there been any success stories or challenges when it comes to communicating with your community? Horror stories? Paul? You're on. It is 2024, but you are on mute. There you go.
So many times today. I was going to ask the same question to the group and my kind of peers, who feels that they do communication well. It's most certainly something that's a consistent feedback that I hear around communication. Who's being communicated, what information is being shared, how often is it being shared inconsistently. So it's something that I feel that I don't hear too much success stories. There's a lot of stones thrown at a national sport organisation or a provincial sport organisation from participants, but just I'd value kind of hearing, does anyone think that they do this well? Is an email enough? Is an email monthly enough? What's our kind of thoughts around this? Especially with the power of social media, and then we finding that is causing more effective communication or just provide a platform for people to rant and be negative. But I don't think I do this too well.
Tammy? I think it's, oh. Yeah, Tammy.
Hey there. So I've worked for a number of sport organizations over the last 20 years. And I think in the last 10 years, particularly with social media being such an important voice for all of us, it's very challenging getting information out to our community, whether it's our athletes, our sponsors, our partners, whatever. We get out the information, but it's who's absorbing it, who's reading it. And I think most of us are probably challenged with the same thing is we have information to share, and what is the best way to disseminate that information? How are we going to get people to read our emails or, take notice of something important that we've posted on social media? So much information is lost because, I agree with everything you just said, Will. I've got that same personal email box that's got a ton of emails. I don't even look at them. I just go delete, 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 delete because I don't have time to go through it all. So we are not doing it well, but I don't know anybody that is doing it really well. I don't know what else to say.
You're right. And I think it's always, and oftentimes say, well, we never got that. It's like, well, you did, but you didn't open your email. So you can't say you didn't get it. Like I can say from my personal experience that there are a few emails that, newsletters I subscribe to, and both content, but it's also when I read it, there's no fat, right? It is just, 100, 200 words. Here are the things you need to know. And there's no fat. And I appreciate that because it's not, we are so pleased to have been honored and graced with the presence of more to have, it's like, we opened a facility, right? Hours are this. And I think if we're able to look at the different ways to have that, to really create that value that when people look at it, this isn't just, I needed to hit my 1,500 word for the newsletter. Here are the key pieces of things that you need to know, and you present them up front. You can have the deeper read down, but basically you're able to keep people's attention and give them that key information within the first 30 seconds of them opening an email. That's for me, I think, and I just know how I engage with those. Those are the pieces I know. That's a value piece. I know it's going to be helpful. They only tell me things that I need to know, and that's really and I've seen that be an effective strategy. Thank you for that, Wendy.
Yeah, I was just gonna sort of add on to what Tammy said. I think it's something, communication is something that you're always striving to improve on. I also think it's important to understand the groups that you're communicating to and the differences and what their needs are or how they receive communication. I'll use our teams, our national teams as an example. Our women's national team want, way more detail and more information than what our men's national team would want in terms of communication and information, and whether that's a gender thing or just the way the teams are, I'm not gonna, but it's really understanding, I think, your groups, if you're dealing with, junior age athletes and you're probably communicating more with the parents, just understanding, I think, the recipient of the communication, and that might help tailor what you're doing and how you're communicating. And then I just think there's so much information that's being sent out, and we're constantly pushing information out. So it is probably a lot and overwhelming, and how much is actually getting through, and what are the important pieces that you want people to see and hear, versus just, throwing so much stuff out all the time. But we feel, at least I feel that, we have to circulate all this information. We have to get it out. We have to push it out because it's important that we can, do our due diligence in that way to keep people informed. But if people aren't really receiving it, then, you're not really doing what you want to be doing at the end of the day. So there's just, it's a big area that I think we struggle with as well.
I think also on that communication, it is a challenge because you mentioned due diligence, like we want to be careful that we're not communicating just because we're trying to satisfy some what we feel is a legal obligation. Because those aren't fun emails to read. No one's going to read them, but we have sort of pushed it to someone else's plate, and I think yeah, I really like the idea of the tailored communication depending on the group, and also not forgetting that we doesn't necessarily have to be that we just send out emails. You know, do we have a quarterly, you know, engagement with our members, our executive, do we have a president's council? Do we have an executive director's council? Do we have an athlete's council? What are the different mechanisms we can look to do to have that correspondence? It's not just emails that we're sending out. Thank you for that. Double Smith. Oh.
Well, I think you kind of covered a little bit of what I was going to share. I realize that it comes down to capacity, and my day job is working for one of the bigger NSOs with Athletics Canada, but we actually have different newsletters for different users. So there's a high performance one that just sends out high performance information. We have a general one, and then I've created one that's for para specific updates. And so that allows us to kind of tailor our information and keep the information in each of them short. And there's also a coach's newsletter. So users can kind of choose which one they want. We can generate lists out of our membership to basically communicate to those people. And then, interestingly enough, as you said at the beginning, I'm always told that people miss the information. And while for a while it's like, well, I'm emailing it, I'm putting it in this newsletter, often goes out on social media, it goes in multiple newsletter, I'm not really sure what else. We did just recently on the para side add a webinar. So anytime there's like a major change, whether it's around an event guideline or we changed our classification pathway or whatever it is, we've decided to add this webinar opportunity where for an hour we kind of review the change, people can ask questions, and we kind of focus on this. And that was mirrored on what they do on the high performance side. So when our team criteria comes out, or a new national team or selection or whatever for any games comes out, they do that on the HP side. Obviously we have Olympics and the Paralympics and all these big teams, but sometimes it's like that's too much, but I've found that it actually helps because it also makes the communication accessible to people in multiple different ways. And so we're trying to do that with the major changes and really catering to specific groups.
I like that, and I think the more you can make it accessible, the more value you can bring to your communications, the better. If you're asking people to take time out of their day, make sure that you're valuing those efforts that they're made. Paul?
Just wonder if there's been any consideration from anyone on the group thinking about kind of board-to-board membership communication using a different platform outside of the traditional email. So dare say like a WhatsApp group or anything like that. Has anyone kind of considered that or thought about that? And I'm just thinking more specifically board to board, so maybe NSO boards to PSO boards or presidents. Has anyone had success? Or
TikTok, Instagram?
I can see a president's TikTok group, everyone's doing their TikToks. But just again, I think it's just something triggered there. Hearing, player groups or WhatsApp, there's more WhatsApp groups happening because people are not using emails. So is a different platform, is it too informal? I don't know.
Jane?
I think if you're going to do something like that, I would want to make sure that it was a little formal. I'm on some groups, and quite frankly, I don't want to look at pictures of cute cats or
Right.
Whatever that is, right? And I think we need to keep it a bit businesslike. So whatever format you're using, I think people need to understand what the purpose is and that kind of thing. If they want to be friends on Facebook too, great, but that's different.
Yeah, I think having a conversation about, you know, I probably 10% of my day is sent. Does 10 o'clock work? No, 11 o'clock works. You know, so looking at the different avenues and what you can do for this communications. Like I know, just because the event I'm at right now, like they'll have abilities where you could only have administrators push out on, I think, Telegram and on WhatsApp. I think you can make a channel. So it's only push. So you can only send things out. It's not for a dialogue, which has, you know, been helpful because yeah, we do have emails and things get buried. You know, if you ignore your emails for 2 days, you're at, you know, 200 emails to get through. It is targeted, and I think just looking at this, it's already been touched on a number of times. But you know, looking at who are the different constituent groups that we have internally and externally, and having everything focused and tailored, and have accessibility as part of that. You know, what do we have for if we have a text heavy or a if we have a image heavy thing? Do we have you know, are the images described? Do we have text that can be enlarged? All those things are also, it's not just how we're sending it and what we're sending it, but also, you know, the vehicle of the delivery to make sure that we do have accessibility. So, and not forgetting our staff that who may or may not be receiving your monthly board communique. Word. And this is, I think, another piece of all of this is, you know, looking at our committees and both from communications in terms of a number of aspects, educational to understand what are the different types of committees, what are their different roles and responsibilities. Who here publishes the terms of reference for their committees? Who here has terms of reference for their committees? All right. Who here do you publish any of them? Peter wins.
So I'll say that we're in the process of just developing our website to do that function. So we will publish our members and our TOR. We just don't have that page and function built yet. It's currently being done.
Peter, I don't know if you want to chime in or.
Well, we kind of have three operational committees of which Jane would be familiar with, and those terms of reference are published on our website. But in fairness as well, we still need to develop some pretty fundamental committees such as finance and governance, and we haven't done that yet. And when we do, we will put the terms of reference for them on. So.
Yeah, and I think that can be helpful. And we've talked a lot about sort of the push out communication, but there are people who are, you know, say, I want to dig into this issue, and they say, I have a selection issue, or, you know, I have so they'll be able to dig and find that having availability can go a long way to satisfy that there's not a wall that's impenetrable that they can't get behind to understand. So, and there's also, I think it's really an education aspect to it to clarify the roles and responsibility of a nominations committee, of a finance, of a governance, of an HR, all these different pieces that you may have and their responsibility. And also make sure that people, I think, sometimes misunderstand, you know, committees are in a way an extension of the board, and that committees have no more authority than the board grants it. And what the board grants, the board may take away. And just to really be clear on, you know, is this, you know, operational? What's its role? What do we do? Who's on it? What are the terms of reference? Are all really important pieces. And then also, how is the communication from the committees to either the board, to the committee, or to the community, to staff? I think really we work hard sometimes to sort of say, this is how the board functions, this is how it's going to align with staff, but we neglect sometimes that a lot of the work is done in committee, and we don't focus as much on, do we have lines of communication coming out of those communities? Peter?
Thanks, Will. And I'm really not trying to monopolize, but I just want to ask a question, which I asked last time. I just want confirmation on this. In your opinion, board-specific committees like finance and audit or HR and compensation, are they often chaired by a board member? And this is all part of the question. And more operational committees, are they often more chaired by someone not a board member? Because my point is, if a board member is chairing like an operational committee, I'm wondering if sometimes they're kind of in a mindset of conflict of interest. Am I representing the operational committee, or am I representing the board committee? I hope I made that question clear. Do you understand, Will?
I think so. And if I answer it wrong, then I didn't, and I take it back and we'll try again. Yeah, like I think one of the key practical advantages of having a board member chair or sit on a committee, any committee, is it's very easy to report back to the board. Peter, you were at the meeting. What happened? Tell us what you don't need to bring in a guest who's now we're saying, well, let's have someone else come in to commit time to sit at the board meeting, provide a report. But it can put board members in a little bit of a bind if they feel like there's a conflict. The realities are their fiduciary, their legal obligations flow to the board in their role as a director, not to their role as a committee, right? Because that is board committee is somewhere in this range. So, they don't have that legal conflict of interest that can arise. I think they can feel conflicted, but they're not necessarily in a conflict of interest. I think operational committees, it makes sense to go outside of the circle if possible, because you're likely oftentimes you'll want that subject matter expertise. We're hosting a world, we're doing this. You may want to have board representation on that operational committee, but you may also want to have subject matter experts that you can draw from the broader committee who aren't necessarily directors or otherwise serving on the board. Now, the test is, did I answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Will. And would it be accurate to say that board committees like finance and audit and HR and compensation are ultimately responsible back to the board, but operational committees are generally back to the CEO, executive director?
I mean, everybody's ultimately responsible to the board. So an operational committee that makes a decision that the board doesn't agree with, well, the board's in charge. They have to clarify, but you can have your lines of communication to address how it works, and often you're operational because they may say, let's spend 100,000, and you're not going to have a board meeting to debate it. It may go to the CEO. So yeah, the normal course of reporting is to operational to CEO or the designated senior staff person, then to the board. But ultimately, the board does have that final oversight and final responsibility. Perfect. I saw a hand that came up and then disappeared. I don't know if it was a mistake or you're just being shy.
It was me, Marnie, in BC out here. Just a question on what you were just talking about there. Would the committee terms of reference include that then, or would that be written in some other policy that person would go directly to the board rather than the committee first if they're in conflict?
So if a board member feels like they're in conflict?
Yeah, so if they were on a committee and they were reporting back, just what we were just talking about there. Would that be written into the committee terms of reference, or would that be written in some other policy? Like, or is that just assumed that that's the way it is? It goes to the board. Your number one priority is the board, and then secondary is the committee.
I mean, that's the law. So I think you'd
Okay.
want to clarify, because
Yeah.
the board member has a fiduciary or that sort of legal obligation to act in the best interest of the organization. So they are a director and have the responsibilities of a director, and a committee member does not hold the same legal position under the governing legislation or the bylaws than as compared with the director.
Okay.
So a committee
So
member is not recognized, let's say, under the For-Profit Act, Societies Act, depending on your jurisdiction, whatever it be, where they have the same legal obligations and responsibilities than as compared to a
as a
director.
board member. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, not for profit. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Paul? You had your hand up. I don't know if there's a reason.
I was just going to say, usually it's outlined in the bylaws, like a strong bylaws would kind of capture exactly what you kind of said, the board empower the CEO to operationalize the organization. So you would kind of avoid those blurred lines, but hopefully would it be good practice for bylaws or something in the bylaws about those roles and responsibilities?
This is where I know people think lawyers have boring jobs and bylaws and governance is never fun, but like there is the art about like how much do we have really rigid and prescriptive bylaws and how much do we have discretion, and it really is we walk the line. And come back to something I said earlier, what's the culture and what do you need? Do you really need to have that firm structure? I I've seen people run afoul of those really prescriptive. You will have these 9 committees. Well, we don't have enough people to staff those 9 committees. So I think you want to be careful about how much you cement committee structures in your bylaws. We've really already covered this piece, AGM, about the communication, board minutes, and it's really, that content, that frequency, and the venue of how we're pushing out and how people know about them. Yeah, I think we've already talked about those pieces, and we won't need to dwell on them unless there's any other questions. I guess bonus points for anybody who can maybe try to identify that movie scene. But in camera sessions, we've touched on this. What is confidential, what is not, and the need to rise in order to pass motions. I will caution that don't go in camera for your entire session, right? Like it is something we don't want to abuse. You really want to use it for circumstances where you're trying to protect that privileged information, what may be sensitive information. Mentioned this last time, but I think it's really important, is that on these communication pieces, on these transparency issues, it's very rarely a single instance where we run afoul. It's a cumulative piece where people don't feel that they're getting the information they need. They're being stonewalled. They don't know where to turn. They don't find anything on the website. So, it are these little steps that we can take that people feel heard, people feel seen, and that we are pushing that information out and making it available. And that the only time you hear from the board is, hey, time for another AGM. Show up and vote for people you don't know and have never seen before. So before we move on to the conflict piece, navigating conflict, any questions on the communications transparency piece? I really appreciate the comments, but are there anything before we leave the topic? Is there anything else that I haven't maybe touched on around that transparency? No? Okay, well, if anything comes to mind, feel free to jump back in. So navigating conflict, and this is deliberately vague. I think conflict is good. I also grew up in a family with 2 younger siblings, so maybe I just was ingrained that that was the reality when you have 3 boys within 5 years of each other, that you'll have a level of conflict on at least a weekly basis. But I think conflict is how we make organizations better, but it always depends on the type of conflict and how we have disagreements. And I think, we talk about generative tension or friction or however we frame it, but if you have one of these gears be entirely smooth, yes, I'm not an engineer, but I have had a bike chain fall off enough to know you're not going to go anywhere. We do need people pulling in different directions. I think it's a huge red flag if you show up at a board meeting and there's no debate, there's no discussion. It's just yes, next item, yes, next item, yes, next item. And that's a concern. We don't have, at best, engagement, but at worst, there's some underlying piece, there's some underlying issue which has made it so that the organization, people in the organization, don't feel that they can speak up or speak out. So I think it is important that, and maybe I've gone too far, is conflict in governance good? You already have my vote, but anybody disagree with me? Not saying that we're going to be in a conflict if you do, but any thoughts on, is conflict good? And the next question is conflict necessary in governance? Jane?
Yes, it depends on what you mean by conflict. Healthy discussion is certainly healthy and debate is certainly healthy. Conflict feels to me a little bit further along the continuum than maybe you want to go.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's, it's a good point about what we mean by conflict in defining it. And I think, some people said conflict is any time that you experience resistance to your ideas or your position. So I think using that low level of tension, conflict, debate, I think we do need, you're right. I think we do need to frame it and make sure that it's not getting to, combat, but that there is a level of discussion. I think it is necessary. I think it's important for people to test ideas, and maybe the idea is going to be sound, and we do want to follow through. But if it's been tested, it's going to be the better for it. Oops. This was on our fridge growing up, but it is important that as we have discussions that, what are the rules for fighting fair? And that we are able to have a level of discussion that really always targets the issues and not the individuals. And it may sound silly, but most of us are conflict avoidant. And most of us don't enjoy having to correct someone. So having a system of debate so that you don't let the loudest voice always speak first or the most senior person always speak first, and that you're able to say, let's talk about how we want to have a discussion. Most of the time it's not going to matter, but hey, when there are those heated moments, how do we navigate that discussion? One mechanism some boards will use is the most junior person speaks first on the ideas. Because if you have the most senior person, the individuals who carry the most amount of weight because they have been in the sports sector for 30, 40 years, because they are a decorated national team, provincial team athlete, it's really hard to say, actually, I think that's not how we would do it. So looking at how you can set yourselves up to say this is how we're going to navigate the tension, navigate discussions in a fair way, and these are the rules of the sandbox, as that were, is a really important piece to being successful and having those degenerative tension, those debates be successful, respectful, and you're able to move ahead together. Does anybody have any approaches to how they navigate, the rules of the sandbox? Somebody actually address, don't say your idea is stupid, but say, I the notion of this is incorrect. Yeah, disagree is fine without being disagreeable. I think the more you can sort of normalize that you are going to have disagreement, the better. And I think you want to have that freedom and that safety for people to disagree. Um, Another element of helping to navigate or get ahead of conflict or in terms of a process is, declarations of a conflict of interest being a standard ask at the start of every board meeting, an AGM. That you're normalizing and you're not putting people in that position of what do we do if someone doesn't declare, that you're bringing it forward and you're celebrating the conflict of interest. We discussed that last time, but I really do think that's part of making sure we have a healthy environment where people feel supported in coming forward about conflicts or disagreements. And in conflict, it's not just, I think we don't want to just let it fester. I think we need to have a discussion and be comfortable in it and saying, we are here because we are of a legal duty. We're tasked with acting in the best interest of the organization. And we can't just hope that the long simmering issue that hasn't been identified is just going to magically solve itself. So how can we deal with conflict? Attack the problem and not the person. I have some ideas on this, but maybe just to go as a group, and I do recognize our time on this. In your experience, where are some of the sources of conflict, and where are they a challenge? No conflict in the organizations?
Well, I would say, Will, that oftentimes just small sports, I know the three that are on here, people just wearing too many hats in too many different roles. I think conflict comes from that, quite frankly. And then some people are just frankly way too close to it. Family involved, children. Um, yeah, some people are just too close to it.
Yeah. And that's tough because very few people have so many volunteers available they can turn folks away. And it is the next session we'll talk about, deepening our pool and broadening our pool of candidates. But in those situations, I think it is really important that we say, here's what we have as an understanding of conflict of interest. I find a lot of times people say, well, there's no money involved, so it's not a conflict. And say, well, no, it's not just financial. It is broader. It is the benefit that someone could receive, and it's not just a monetary benefit. So making sure we have those conversations that people do understand this is a big source of tension, or other challenges that may come up. Oop, Paul?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think you made a comment about this before that I can't remember if it's on a webinar, but conflict shouldn't be seen as a negative thing. Conflicts aren't bad, so it might be massively beneficial. I agree with Peter's point, people wear multiple hats, but it might be massively advantageous to have somebody on the board that has a conflict. And if it's managed well, then the sport benefits from it. So I don't know, I can't remember the phrase that you used about that conflict isn't a bad thing to declare. It's almost seen as a bit of a naughty list on the minutes sometimes, that kind of perception of what a conflict is.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And in that context, yeah, the issue of the conflict of interest is sort of what we're looking at here. And I can circulate this. It's the SDRCC had a handy flow chart to say, am I in a conflict of interest? Which is a helpful piece. I will say, I have yet to have a call with someone says, am I in a conflict of interest? And the answer be, no, you're in the clear. Usually our people's smell test is pretty highly calibrated. They just want me to absolve them. And that is not my job. I do not provide that. But in this, in this context of this conflict being conflict of interest, to encourage people to come forward, and that we don't make, the connotation of the word is not a negative one, but we actually celebrate people coming forward. And I think having clarity on what are those lines where it is, a question mark, or where it's like, no, you're in the clear, or absolutely not, you can't be in that decision in that room, is important. And that we do celebrate. I don't know, give people pins for declaring conflicts of interest, but do normalize that declaration. It's a very small text. I will circulate this list. It is in a publication available through the SDRCC. Paul?
Sorry, Will, lots of questions coming to mind here. Do you want to just maybe share your thoughts on, this might not necessarily be anyone on the call, but since the kind of Canadian governance codes, athletes on boards has most certainly brought up quite a lot of discussions, massively beneficial, having athletes on boards. And again, going back to that point, a conflict isn't a bad thing, but just what your kind of general thoughts are when it comes to athletes, because most decisions made at a board will be impacting athletes, budgetary cuts, programs, strategic planning, where you're going to prioritize your money, time, and resources. But just your athletes, I feel, are in a difficult space. But just your general thoughts on that, as it kind of meets kind of conflict of interest threshold.
Yeah. Well, it's meaningful representation is what it puts in the code. I mean, I think it's being normalized as they're appointed or elected as a director on the board, but the code, I believe this is it is meaningful representation. A couple of things. One, agree, having an athlete perspective on boards is highly helpful. Really gives a perspective of challenges. You always need to consider what is their definition of athlete, because the code does have quite a broad, I believe it's 8 or 9 years from retired from competition. So I think that is one avenue that you can look to reduce potential conflicts if they're not as serving athletes. Oftentimes, athletes don't have the capacity to serve on a board. If they're still currently in competing, depending on what point they are in their campaign. Mentioned don't just that you just don't want to have rely on that one director. We talked about communication over saturation. How are we setting up the correspondence with athletes? Do we have an athletes council? Do we have notes that go out to the high performance, to our provincial members? How are we setting up that communication so we don't just simply put it all on the shoulders of the 1 or 2 athlete reps? Maybe more specifically, Paul, to your question, it does give rise to an inherent conflict of interest. And there is a tension in the code to say we want to have at least 40% of directors be independent, but then we also want to have athletes, it's implied that they serve on boards. And I think we need to be careful about that. I believe, we can navigate it, but we just need to have, if we do an onboarding, if we do have athletes, how can we have a discussion with our new board about what is conflict of interest and what's not conflict of interest to minimize that piece, and ensure if there are controversial pieces of cutting funding or things like that, that we're ensuring that there is a conflict declared and they're not participating. I'm in a different time zone, and it's a little bit earlier in the morning where I am than those folks back in Canada. So apologies for the yawns. I don't know if anybody's had to go through this, but if necessary, you can, as a board, say, Paul, you're in a conflict of interest. You cannot participate. Right? I think that's a very uncomfortable situation, but if necessary, to preserve the legitimacy of the board, you can bring a motion to declare someone in a conflict and have them barred from participating in that discussion and that vote. So it is something maybe to recall on that, but it is tension, And in the evaluative context of the code, I don't, the minister has indicated that it is likely to change, that I expect we'll see some more pieces brought forward on that athlete voice, and likely cementing it within the code. We're in the home stretch. I think we may save some of the pieces around safe sport maybe for the next session, because it is a big topic and I do want to do it justice. Maybe just to focus on this slide and then talk about, see if there's any more questions. Has anybody either read this book or seen these notions of psychological safety? That's something that, yeah, I know, because I know, like, we have the UCCMS talk about psychological maltreatment, but try to always talk about not just what don't do, but what we should do. And I think, if we look at these 4 stages, and I like this graph because it's a little more exciting than some of the other things we would see. When we have created an environment of psychological safety, which is both at the board level, in our performance programs, in our community groups, our community level, when we've served in that 4th pillar, it is that safety to challenge the status quo, to put your hand up and say, I know this is the way we've been doing it, but maybe instead of jumping at the bar with our faces, we should jump with it at our back, or or this has been the technique, but what about this? So looking at how we can challenge the past, the history, and not just accept, well, that's the way we do it around here. And at the governance table, that we're empowering voices, be they athletes, be they new directors, be there people who maybe are from outside the sport community who are being brought on, that we're making sure their voices are heard. And that we don't let this notion of creating a psychologically safe space just be something that we hope happens, that we're being deliberate in it. I mentioned earlier about, we have an order of discussion to ensure that we're hearing from everybody, but that you do make efforts to be deliberate in shaping your board, and the participation of everybody. Does anybody have any practices that they feel contribute to the creation of a psychologically safe space? Do you feel psychologically safe to say it in this context? I will say, having small measures to ensure that everybody's voice feels valued and heard is a really important piece. And if it is an art to managing the meetings, to making sure that everybody feels comfortable to speak up. And this is in the governance context, but it equally applies in the teams that we may have. So I'm just looking at time. I want to leave the balance for later, because we have another session and we can talk into them. We can talk about it then. So just we do have 5-6 minutes. So when we're looking at this, and today was really more about a little more theoretical discussions. The last piece I didn't talk about was a little bit about safe sport and how, from a governance perspective, how we can set effective mechanisms and processes in place. Maybe I will just ask the question, just so we can set ourselves up for our final session in the next couple of weeks. If we were thinking about navigating conflict in this context being safe sport, what are some of the challenges that, from a governance side, that people are feeling? Recognize we only have the 5 minutes, but maybe we can at least start the conversation and continue it in our next session. Or is everybody comfortable with the safe sport piece?
Well, maybe a comment. What I think one of the challenges for us, and Wendy, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, is three sports that haven't experienced. More people have kind of concerns about safe sport because they maybe had to manage a complaint. But I think we've been fairly fortunate that we've dealt with complaints and conflicts, but never had that kind of public kind of court of public opinion on social media, like a Hockey Canada, gymnastics, a swimming, an artistic swimming. So makes it kind of very difficult what to fear with safe sport. I find, unless you've kind of experienced it. Peter, I don't know if you're a bit different with that.
Yeah, I would agree with Paul that, until we actually go through a case with the Office of Sport Integrity Commissioner, which we fortunately haven't yet, we don't know what we don't know a little bit. But to answer your question around governance, Will, I think that was your question around governance, safe sport. It's not even a governance thing. I just think that it's safe sport. There's general definitions and meaning behind it, but it takes on a different level when it comes to maybe some of our sports. So I'm just going to refer to bocce, for example. I mean, we do things that other sports would say, well, that's not right. So we do have people sharing a room with our athletes because they need them for support. Our athletes, we call them performance partners, you can call them sport assistants, but they may need help for transfers, getting in and out of bed, grooming, bathrooming. That happens, quite frankly, in our sport. So I just think that safe sport, you adapt it to fit your environment and you do the best you possibly can. So it isn't the same thing amongst all sports, using bocce as an example.
No, I agree. And I think, the UCCMS is trying to do one size fits all, but I'll say like the notion of grooming in the UCCMS is very different than the context in which you just used it. And that's, that language is a challenge because, it doesn't necessarily reflect the realities. And I think we'll touch on this more in the next session, but we can't lose sight that safe sport is an aspect of sport safety, and they are very different pieces. And I think we can't lose sight of that because, what you described is a clear aspect of the safety of our sport, that we are not leaving athletes who require assistance or care with transfers and things like that alone. So that we don't let safe sport be the driving piece, that we're actually being deliberate in making sure that we have, the prominent piece is, are we making a safe environment? And it's not just, are we rigidly adhering to the doctrines of safe sport to the detriment of the overall well-being of our athletes and our participants. And we'll touch more on that in the next when we're looking at sort of the issues for the future. Anyone want to get a closing question or comment in before we wrap things up for the day? Am I allowed to say you've been a great audience? I don't know if that's the right language used, but I really have appreciated the comments and the questions tonight. And I'll look forward to our last session in a few weeks' time. So I don't know, Paul, Peter, if there's anything we'd like to do to wrap things up, or if that's it.
Just to say thank you, and I'll submit an email asking for some feedback, and I'll put the slides onto that email. But if anyone wants to put any feedback, we share that with Will, so you can build the context for the next webinar. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll also have the video shared shortly as well. But thank you everyone for making the time.
All right. Good night, everybody.